Good evening, everyone. My name is Ravindran, and welcome everyone to this program that's being organized by the Robert Ford Center for Data Science and AI. Very quickly, I'll introduce you to the center. The center started in 2017 as a way of furthering fundamental research in data science and AI, and also look at improving societal impact of these algorithms, right? So the vision and mission of the center is to achieve global prominence in AI and data science while carrying out foundational research as well as creating top quality engineers. We work in many different areas of AI and data science, such as deep learning, network analytics, and in some of these areas, we have the largest group in the country, such as in reinforcement learning and the network analytics. And we also look towards launching and conducting quality education programs, and also work on a lot of projects with societal impact, right? And we have extensive collaborations both with governmental bodies as well as with industry. And just to give you a sampler of some of the socially relevant projects, so we work on improving the 101 emergency response service in collaboration with the government. We work with Google and with a non-governmental organization called Armand in improving, in helping to improve, pregnant mother and newborn babies' welfare, right? And similarly, we work with this organization called THSTI and funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, looking at improving preterm birth prediction in India. And we also been partnering with various organizations on building a genome database for India, and look at capacity building and R&D for several government organizations, including the Ministry for Statistics and Program Implementation, the Indian Navy, the DRDO, and so on and so forth. So a variety of different projects that we run that have significant societal impact. Right, and we organize many programs with regard to research and education. So we conduct regular events where we get in long ago, so long ago before COVID, we used to have these very large events that were organized, where we had people from the industry, startup, established industry, people from other colleges participate in regular workshops and conclaves, and we used to run many summer programs. We are continuing to run an online certificate in technology and management jointly with IIM Bangalore on data science and management. And we also offer a 5-year dual degree program in data science and IIT Madras. And so there are many ways in which people can engage with the center. We have a lot of scholarships and also many outreach initiatives. So including the postdoctoral fellow, the postbaccalaureate fellow, and various kinds of associate programs. Please visit our website for more details on this on these programs. And so the main agenda for today is to introduce the distinguished fellows of RBCDSAI. So this is a new initiative that we launched to recognize people who are long-term collaborators of the center, but who also created great impact, and they're very well recognized and respected names globally in the field of data science and AI. And so the 3 fellows that we have initially welcomed on board are Professor Kriti Ramamritam, who was a chair professor in the Department of Computer Science and Engineering at IIT Bombay, and Professor Sriram Natarajan, who is at UT Dallas and is currently the director for the Center of Machine Learning there. And the star speaker of today, Professor Parthasarathy, who is from Ohio State. Right? So all 3 of them have stellar records in research, and as we meet them, I'll talk about each of the distinguished fellows. And we are really honored that every one of them has actually accepted this fellowship from us and have chosen to associate themselves with our center. Right. And to talk a little bit more about today's speaker, so Professor Srinivasan is a professor of computer science and engineering, and the director of the data mining research lab at Ohio State. His research interests span data analytics, databases, and high performance computing. He's among a handful of researchers nationwide to have won Department of Energy and NSF Career Awards. Right. He and his students have won multiple Best Paper Awards or Best of nominations in almost all leading data mining forums like SIAM Data Mining, ACMC, KDD, VLDB, and so on and so forth. He chairs the SIAM Data Mining Conference Steering Committee, which is an elected position, and serves on multiple editorial boards of journals. And since 2012, he's also helped lead the creation of Ohio State's first of a kind nationwide undergraduate major in data analytics and serves as one of its founding directors. And in some sense, I mean, programs like these are the inspiration for us to start our own dual degree program in data science and AI. And Srini has been a frequent visitor to the center and has collaborated extensively with us in the past and has been a great friend and advisor and mentor to us. I really thank you, Srini, for accepting our invitation to be a fellow and also agreeing to give the talk today. And the host for today is Professor Arun Rajkumar. He's a faculty at the Computer Science Department at IIT Madras. And Arun works in the field of optimization for machine learning and also in learning with complex loss functions and so on and so forth. And Arun is one of our star machine learning researchers at IITM and as well as at the center. And Arun will be hosting it, and he'll be joined by a graduate student, Pavan Ravishankar, as well. So if you have any questions about the center, please feel free to visit us. We are also on all social media and do follow us there. And I hand over now the control to Arun. So Arun, please take over.
Thanks, Professor Ravi, for the introduction, and welcome Professor Srini to this virtual fireside chat on AI and ethics with RBCDSAI and us. So let me maybe first start by kind of asking you a very broad question, right? So AI and ML, right, so has been around for decades, but more and more people have started talking about ethics and AI maybe in the last few years, last 5 to 6 years. So what is ethics in AI according to you, and why do you think there is an exponential increase in interest in ethical AI recently?
Thanks for the question, and Ravi, Arun, and everybody else from RBCDSAI, thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. So Arun, this is a very important question, what you just raised. And we have to, I mean, always with these kinds of things, we have to take into account some historical perspective. So ethics, as it is defined in a broad sense, goes back to the Greek philosophers. It goes back to the triumvirate, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. I mean, in the broadest sense possible, let me first define how I view ethics. And it is, in a sense, a way of life and a moral code. And these are the two things, moral fiber, as some like to refer to it, as the basic tenets of ethics. So way of life could include things like, you practice a certain way of life. And it could be, there are connections to religion in that context. There are connections to, how you proceed with your day-to-day activities. Moral code is more, a little more, I guess, also personal, but a little more subjective in some senses. Now, Socrates was probably the first, at least that we are aware of from the literature, to understand the importance of studying these things and ascribing a means to, looking at these things from the perspective of what is good, what is right, what is just, what is virtuous, and articulating standards for these properties. And, one could argue that the third component of ethics is, studying both way of life and moral code. And basically, Socrates articulated the need for this. Now, he in turn inspired his student Plato. Plato certainly was more of an idealist, in the grand scheme of things. And so he examined these kinds of questions from more of an idealistic direction for finding answers to the kinds of questions that Socrates posed. Now, in turn, his student Aristotle is probably considered the fountainhead of, moving one towards more a factual definition, or moving people more towards a factual definition of ethics. And so Aristotle certainly started looking at ethics from the context of biology, ethics from the context of laws of nature and things like that. So all of these folks, I mean, we are talking back in, 5th century BC, and maybe Aristotle was the last of them. Maybe he was there in 4th century BC. I don't remember the timeline exactly, but that's roughly the timeline that these people were putting out these different treatises on ethics. In more modern times, I would say that perhaps one of the most influential individuals on this was Hume. And, he had a couple of magnificent treatises that also influenced, other areas, like it influenced Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations. So he had a treatise of human nature and, an inquiry into, I don't remember the exact title, but it's an inquiry into morals. And Hume actually took, some of these things, what Socrates was talking about with respect to good, right, just, virtuous, and what standards they are attributed to individuals and actions, and how it is possible for individuals to cultivate, ethics, morality, possibly at the expense of self-interest. And this is important because there is this Pareto optimality here between these two things, because there is self-interest on the one side, and there is, moral fiber and, way of life at some senses on the other side. So this is something that he brought to bear on this particular topic. And he also pointed out multiple standards of evaluation. One is more of a utilitarian. What is the gain? And that also adds an interesting constraint to this, what is essentially a multi-criterion objective function. And the other is rational confirmation, a rational, approach. And the other is the feeling, going back to the subjectivity, which is much more, personal in some senses. Now, getting back, so that was a bit of a long-winded, response to the ethics question. But your question, I think, says, what about AI and ethics? So it's basically, one way to think about this is it's ethics plus X. So any new technology, in some senses, newish technology, again, we are talking about the scales of centuries here. So AI is certainly new in that sort of scale sense. So any significant form of technology is going to impact society. We saw this with the Industrial Revolution. We saw this with, Reformation, for example, which like with the, printing presses and so on. And so any significant form of technology is going to ultimately impact society. And changes in society are going to directly influence and shape both our perceptions of way of life and our moral code. And there's a collective moral code, which most people will agree on. And then there is more of an individual or subjective sort of code. And these changes are often nuanced, often gradual when you look at it from the scales of time, like from year to year or, month to month. But when viewed from the lens of, coarser scale, 50, 100 years, you're going to see a significant change. And second, and certainly, AI is right in the middle of some of these discussions. So that's something that is there to stay. And I think a lot of the conversations and a lot of the rigorous debate we are seeing played out, both in, the regular media, in social media, and so on and so forth, is actually in a way a good thing, because it gets the conversation rolling. And I think it's an important thing that we need to be thinking about these things in a broad sense. So that's my answer to the initial question about why I think this is important and why we need to be thinking about it now.
Yeah. So, and the other question was about why is it people are doing it more now? Is it because we are more exposed to data and companies are using data more, or is that the main reason why the community has shifted its focus, right, from not just algorithms but also these meta aspects of algorithms like privacy, fairness, accountability, and those things, right? So
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, a lot of this has I mean, once a technology reaches a point where it starts to impact pretty much everyone, you're going to see, as I said, it's going to have an impact on society. And once it starts having that impact on society, these things definitely will be amplified and come to the fore. We've seen this historically. So this is not surprising, but this is certainly one of the main reasons for, why in some senses, this call to arms that you're seeing in terms of why people need to start thinking about this. But again, I mean, one thing I want to clarify here, I think it's important to have the discussion started. I don't think we have anywhere close to a perfect solution to any of these problems at this point. So this is still a work in progress, by and large. And again, but it is something that I think is important, that if you are a student of data science or a student of AI, this is something that I think everyone should start thinking about from in a careful sense. At least that's my encouragement to my students. I'm running a class right now, and it's always good to get multiple perspectives on this problem, because as I said, one thing I'm going to keep repeating in this conversation is it's not a one-size-fits-all solution.
Exactly. So, so the other thing is, when you spoke about Socrates and Plato and so on, right? So ethics has its own footing in philosophy and so on, where things like, one should do good, there should be just, fair, and so on, right? So these are, everybody would probably agree to these principles at high level. But then the tricky part is that these principles, different groups might interpret these principles in different ways. And especially when you are kind of looking at AI systems, right? So production level AI systems. So what do you think are some practical challenges when you are trying to develop what are called as ethical AI systems?
Yeah, so this is actually a great question. Okay, so, there are, and this is also related to a study that we've recently done. So you can think of, a couple of different ways at which you can approach this problem. And these are broad strategies, and I'm not trying to shoehorn or pigeonhole, everything people have looked at into these two things. But broadly, there are two sort of ways in which, individuals and organizations can think about these. One is to define, principles, and try to align with with those principles. And I would say that strategy, in some sense, falls into, the idealism approach towards ethics. So there is, principles, and you align with it. Now, the other part of your question is that these principles are subjective. What may work, for example, if you're thinking about nation states in Brazil, may be different than what may work in India. That may be different than what may work in Singapore, may be different than what may work in the UK or the US. So, and I'm talking nation states here. You bring it down to the level of an individual. I think, as you pointed out correctly, there are certain things that I think everyone will find common ground on. Just like what, constitutes a crime, I think there are common grounds for that. And so there are laws around, the governance laws around that, for the common ground. And then the thing with ethics is, there's a lot of gray area. So, and that gray area means different individuals and different organizations and different nation states may choose to, be in different parts of this. If you think about this gray area as a manifold, they could be on different parts of this manifold. So that is one thing. Now, with respect to the things you can find common ground on, and that's why I think discussions like this are very, very important. The other approach people have taken is, let's start regulating this, um, from both the ethical and fairness standards. And so one school of thought has been, let's start figuring out what should those regulations, those common laws or common grounds be, and let's start figuring out what that regulation should look like so that individuals, organizations, and maybe even nation states begin to comply with those fairness and ethical and fairness standards. So those are sort of the two sort of general schools of thought in terms of approaching this problem. One is more, I would say, more in the idealism space. The other is more perhaps utilitarian, as promoted by someone like you.
Maybe I'll pass the ball to Pawan. If Pawan, you have a question.
Right. The recent Timnit Gebru incident, right? This really drew my attention towards AI ethics, and of course, I could not see a lot of idealism there. There was a lot of fight on Twitter. What is your take on the Timnit Gebru incident? Do you think that the marriage of AI ethics and AI business is really difficult? Because I've seen Sundar Pichai making statements saying that they want to regulate products from Google itself. But what is your take on that? Do you think AI ethics and business is a really hard marriage?
Pawan, this is an excellent question. Now, I have to say that I, like you, have only seen, some of. I'm neither on Twitter nor on Facebook. So I'm not on social media in general. So I'm probably, one of the few in this virtual room that can say that. So, but I have followed some of the discussion in the blog posts and things like that. I have to say that since I don't know the details, it would be hard for me to comment on this specific aspect. However, your other part of your question, is related to why are businesses, or, how can businesses and corporations start looking at these kinds of things? And this is very much related to a 100-page report that we just, finished, that looks at, this current state of practice. I mean, what are businesses doing right now? So this particular, analysis and problem that we focused on was looking at, specifically focused on corporate or business data ethics. And so this particular study involved interviews with around 30 odd chief privacy officers, in some cases even, chief ethics officers, chief technical officers of, large companies. All of the ones, I think almost all of the ones we interviewed were from Fortune 500 companies. Some were from leading think tanks that are looking at these kinds of things, like the Future Privacy Forum and things like that. So we looked at, we carefully interviewed about 30 odd professionals who've spent their career thinking about these problems, especially in the business context. We spent, in addition to that, we had a much broader survey that went out to a larger number of companies and organizations. So what we found, at a high level from that study, is that the first thing that all of these individuals commented about or thought about were, what are the threats from advanced analytics and AI? So ultimately, you want to think about, even if you have developed an algorithm, a neat algorithm, and your intent, and perhaps we'll probably come back to intent, because that's an important aspect in the overall ethics conversation. But one of the first things that we heard from them about was, what are the threats? What are the summary of the threats? And we've listed in our study, we've listed a lot of them, but they include things like what you just said: privacy, manipulation of vulnerabilities, in the sense that, AI can be used in some senses to create some kind of power imbalance, bias, both from the perspective of procedural unfairness and from the context of protected classes. Error, I mean, we all know, and that is something AI and data science technologies deal with, and causes of error. And of course, I mean, one of the things that we heard during the Industrial Revolution, we heard in the 50s with automated manufacturing of cars, is displacement of labor. I mean, again, this is history repeating itself. That is, will AI replace humans? And of course, ultimately harmful use. I mean, these are some of the threats that these folks in the surveys and also in the detailed interviews brought up. Now, why do companies choose to pursue data? I mean, choose to look at data ethics carefully. So most of the individuals we interviewed, as well as the organizations surveyed, see it as well beyond risk mitigation. So it's not just about meeting what the law says. Basically, the point, and this is something that people in the AI and data science community certainly know, technology is advancing very, very rapidly. So there are regulation and governance laws that are starting to come out, but it's significantly, I mean, the rapid pace of technology is something these, governance and regulatory laws simply, they can't keep up to speed with it. So there is a lag there. And so that's part of the reason why these companies and organizations say that, that's why we're thinking about doing more than simply complying with existing law. Now, again, as Hume pointed out in his treatise, ultimately this is about, why are companies worried about this? I mean, there is some self-interest in this as well. And they want to make sure that their consumers are happy, and they want to make sure that their reputation is intact. So trust plays a very important role here. In some cases, the corporate structure has very strong inherent values, and that plays a role in their ethics plans, and incorporating sort of ideas that are increasingly common, like corporate social responsibility or doing things for the social good, and so on. So how have these companies, and this study, what we talk about is basically how have these, so we know why, we have the motivation for why they do this, but how have they started implementing some of these ideas? So this report actually tries to provide a snapshot of the current state of art in terms of how they're looking at this. So that there are three sort of major ways in which companies are starting to look at this from the perspective of data science and AI in particular. The first is they are attempting to look at this from substantive benchmarking perspective. So again, going back to what I said before, what are the common ground principles? What are the benchmarks that we need to look at it? And they're coupling it also with some, and this was a very interesting part of the study. They're coupling this also with, some informal thoughts. Would my mother and grandmother approve of this particular thing? I mean, so common sense reasonings in terms of what is that moral fiber that this company or organization or individual should stand for. And of course, it's about risk management and policies as well. But so they have some of those in place as well. Now, on the other side, how are they implementing this from the management perspective? There is definitely the rise of more and more companies having a designated, starship commander, or if you will, or a chief ethics officer. And that person is also, many of these large companies also supplement that with an ethics committee. Some organizations talked about, having sort of what is akin to a hub and spoke model. We have, each group has someone who is looking at, ethics of whatever that group is developing, and that person reports back to Starship Command or the chief ethics officer and the ethics committee. And again, you talked about Timnit. I will point out that a lot of companies have started looking at ways to improve checklists in terms of how they look at ethics. And this is very much related to some recent work that people in the NLP community are looking at seriously. Last year's best paper was a paper on checklists, and Timnit has this really nice piece of work that she and others have done, which is perhaps models should have something like model cards associated with it. So those kind of things play a role, and people are starting to pay attention to those kind of ideas. Now, from the technology perspective, in addition to model cards and checklists and things like that, companies are looking at things like data privacy and anonymization, and that's been going on for well over a decade. Increasingly, companies are paying careful attention to algorithmic fairness, and something that Arun mentioned before, explainable and auditable algorithms. So those are things they're starting to look at. And from the system side of things, if you want you want the ability to audit things, you need system support. So auditable systems and the use of things like virtualization for those kind of things. So this was a pretty long answer to that question, but this also summarizes some work that we've been doing, and I'm happy to share a link to that work. And this has been shared with a lot of policy think tank folks and government entities, both in the US and international.
Mm-hmm. So as a quick follow-up to that discussion, right?
Yeah.
So privacy is something that probably it is easy to impose a legal framework on, right? Whereas something like explainability, I don't know how easy it is even to impose a legal framework on it. So the question is, how much do you think there should be a legal involvement when we are defining rules for explainability, right? So because big companies right now use all these deep learning based models, and there is always an explainability versus accuracy trade-off there. That is
Yeah.
always there, right? So do you think that if there is a legal restriction on developing explainable models, would businesses be okay with doing that at the risk of taking a hit on accuracy?
No, I don't think there is going to be, to answer your question, I don't think, and I wasn't suggesting that either, so I'll make that clear. I think explainability is more of one way to think about it is more of a derived need to facilitate. So, so suppose your privacy policy or your data sharing policy says you will not share data, and you will not use this data for any purpose except X, Y, and Z. Okay. Now, if a model inadvertently, or perhaps the person who developed it inadvertently uses data from that particular user who has this sign, how do we know that that model is really using that or not? I mean, so we need a way to both audit and ensure that whatever strictures are in place, and this is also related to the other sort of issue, burning issue right now, at least, is the whole WhatsApp, Facebook privacy question. And so you need to be able to facilitate the ability to audit these things. Why is explainability essential? Okay, explainability is essential because you need to be able to show or demonstrate that your model is not using any data that it shouldn't be using. And you need to be able to show that your model is not causing, any harm to certain subgroups, for example. How do you show that if you treat this as a black box? So you need explainability in order to facilitate some of these things. So for some of these things, you have laws like, GDPR, again, it's a stake in the ground. It's not perfect. but it's a stake in the ground. And it basically says, if someone says, you have to forget my data, how do you go and erase all that from all the models that has used that data so far, unless you understand what the models are doing? So explainability is almost like a derived need. That's why I think of it as a derived need rather than something directly that is going to be regulated. Arun, to answer your sort of question, I think it's super, super important to have explainable and transparent. I mean, I talked about, the gray space in ethics in general. There's a huge gray space in what is explainable enough, and explainability can mean different things to different people. So, I mean, if you're talking to a data scientist, maybe explainability means the data scientist wants to understand, what each part of the model is doing and how it's working with it. If you're talking to a layperson who's come in for, a loan application, the explanation needs to be what that person could do to improve her or his chances the next time around, in case they were turned down for the loan this time. So what are, the explainability, what you explain also depends on who you're talking to. If you're talking to, again, another example, if you're talking to a clinician, and especially if that particular, the clinician happens to be in a country with very strong laws with respect to malpractice, they don't want to use black box solutions. They want something that they can understand, because their career is on the line if they're just going to treat it as a black box. So explainability is important as a facilitator, but it is not directly something that, at this point, at least, we don't have, I don't think there's any regulation that says everything that's used has to be explainable yet. That would be a hard constraint. It could happen in some sort of situations, but that would be a challenge, because we're not quite there yet in terms of understanding what these deep models actually do. I mean, there's been a huge push in the research community to get going on this, and I think we will see more and more models shift from being black box to gray boxes, and maybe some that eventually become transparent and still effective. But there is an inherent trade-off as it stands right now in the field, as you pointed out, between explainability and accuracy, or explainability and utility.
So I'll take a quick question from then on. So you just said that there's a lot of push from the research community as far as explainability is concerned. So is there so how do you see the dispute resolution strategy evolve over time? Because on one side, there is this AI community focusing on building explainable models. And then there's this dispute resolution that has to slowly pick up. As of now, you mentioned there is GDPR and at a higher level. But at a lower level, at a level of arbitration or mediation, do you see more things coming up? And how do you see these things evolve, not just from the explainability side, but also from the dispute resolution side? Because I think there's a vested interest if the chief ethics officer takes charge of the dispute resolution, because he'll be representative of the company. But if you put someone else outside, then he or she will not be able to understand the products. So there's this dilemma of dispute resolution and explainability. And could you please elaborate on that?
Yeah, in fact, this is a very good point you're making. I mean, we've deliberated this in some of our, internal discussions at Ohio State, and I work pretty closely with some folks in the law school who have some strong thoughts on this. In fact, there's not quite the same sort of thing that you're talking about. I mean, I think one way to put it in simple terms is, if you have a company that is, in the space of autonomous vehicles, and that company's car, gets into an accident, who's liable? I think and it turns out that the fault is on the driverless car and not on the other individuals or involved in the accident. Now, who's liable? Is it the company that manufactures the car, Is it the company that manufactures the AI technology? Is it the company that manufactures the chips? Okay. I don't think legal scholars have an answer to this question yet. I mean, this is definitely a legal question. This is definitely something that people have to think about, carefully. I know that legal scholars across the world are looking at this, and so that's one aspect of it. The other aspect of it is, I mean, if you go back to, the right to privacy, you go back to the, 1961 UN resolution, human rights, and data. Those are some things that have existed now for 5 decades or more, almost 6 decades. So these are things that, again, people are thinking about. So one of my colleagues here has a very nice paper. I highly recommend the read, you guys to look at it. It's titled, I mean, and he channels, his inner Ernest Hemingway, I guess. It's titled "For Whom the Data Tolls." I think that's the phrase that he uses in the title of the paper. And in that work, I'm thinking it's in that work, but I'll have to double check this. But in sort of some of his work that he's been examining, questions that impact, whether, say, so in the US Constitution, there is the Fourth Amendment, which is evidence and warrant required to search a person's home. And there's the Fifth Amendment, which is self-incrimination. And the question that he is asking in some of his research is, how do these things apply to things like Fitbit personal monitors? So is a Fitbit personal monitor something internal to an individual? And is this, if, say, a crime has been committed in a particular home, is law enforcement allowed to take the Fitbit personal monitor and use that information because it has information about locations that the individual has visited? Or is that considered, something intrinsic to the individual? Does the Fourth Amendment apply or the Fifth Amendment apply? I mean, legal scholars are still thinking about these kind of questions. So I don't think this is definitely much more a legal question. And in India, of course, I mean, there was about a year and a half ago, I think Justice Sri Krishna had a report on data protection and data privacy. And in Europe, people are looking at these things. So this is something that, organizations across the world are starting to look at in sort of, in careful ways. That is, if you have data that is personal in nature, is that something that should be, available? It also depends on utility. I mean, at the end of the day, Fitbits, there have been several reports where these kind of fitness trackers have been incredibly useful in saving people's lives. So Apple now markets a watch, and there are other companies that do it as well, that markets a watch that measures, important signals that they get from the heart and so on. And so these are things that, and utility wise, an individual may decide that this is information that they want to share so that it improves their health and potentially others as well. And again, I mean, on a related note, I mean, we're all in the midst of this pandemic right now. There's a lot of data sharing going on that is for, overall social good or overall community health and so on and so forth. So some of these data sharing things that are going on in the pandemic context are things that 2 years ago, people would have not been that comfortable doing. They're much more comfortable doing it now because of the situation we are finding ourselves in. And so that adds, additional questions from the technology space, from the regulation space, from the perspective of data science, AI, and ethics.
So another sort of a gray area with respect to ethics is this notion of autonomy, right? So let's say I'm browsing the internet and I've been shown a lot of ads, and then that kind of influences me to buy certain sort of things and so on. Whereas I might have taken a different decision if I had known what is available and I make the decision myself rather than being shown something, right? So in your study, did this come up as an ethical consideration at all, or what are your thoughts about this?
Yeah, I mean, some individuals did bring this up as, this is this can be. I mean, this could be something that could be considered as a manipulation of vulnerabilities, the example you described. So certainly, several interviewees brought this up, and that is something that at least some organizations are paying attention to. Not as many. I mean, again, we in our survey we have a list of how many companies thought about each one. I think I can say without, I mean, I don't recollect the exact numbers right now, but privacy was on everybody's list. But then some of the others, like displacement of labor and perhaps manipulation of vulnerabilities, were lower down. Harmful use was, again, I don't know if this would fall under the category of harmful use. It depends on what the specific case is, but it certainly falls under the category of manipulation of vulnerabilities. So to answer your question, it did come up in our study as one of the threats that data science and AI can potentially pose here. And it is something that some organizations are paying careful attention to. Not all.
So now, so going forward, right? So maybe in the next 5 years, right? So if you have to develop ethical AI systems, so there are different pieces in this moving parts, right? So one is the data acquisition and what data you use. The other is how do you incorporate this ethics into the algorithms itself, and the third is the legal process and so on, right? So so what should be, where should the focus be, right? So as people who want to develop ethical systems, right? So where should the main focus be in the next 5 years?
So could sorry, Arun, I had a slight bandwidth issue here. I heard one of them. Could you repeat the three again?
So I was talking about more the data collection part and using only certain features. I mean, even before you start using an algorithm, right? So the data collection and pre-processing part. The other is the pipeline where the algorithm, incorporating fairness and other things into the algorithmic part of it. So we're making algorithms fair. The third is bringing in the legal aspects and saying that you should do only this, you should not do this, right? So, I mean, all three are important, but as a research community, right? So what do you think would be the focus in the next few years?
Yeah, so I think the legal part is the one that's probably going to, I mean, again, as I said, the legal part is, ultimately these things are subjective. As I said, ethics is a gray area and it's subjective, and legal usually tries to focus on what is common ground, what everybody considers in a particular, community or a nation state, or and that is something that is happening. I think your point about, data, what you can do in terms of ethical treatment of data through the data life cycle. I think auditable systems that support the kind of data pre-processing and making sure that the data is sanitized completely before it is used is something that has to be given careful consideration. And I think, the other aspect is also important. So it's hard for me to say that one is more important or less important than the other. I think we need to have solutions to both of those. The legal and governance part, that is ultimately, by the way, just to be clear, the legal part is something that nation states have to come up with. Governance could be internal to a company. So a lot of that could happen at a faster pace than, say, and certainly some of the companies we surveyed are doing more. I don't want to take specific names here, but some companies are doing an outstanding job, all things considered, while other companies are just starting to think about some of these problems. So at least based on the organizations that we surveyed in our study. But all of the ones that we surveyed, and maybe there was some, sampling bias elements here, do think this is, did say that this was important and something that they are considering. So everyone's thinking about it. Some have a much more structured way of looking at this problem. And they are looking at it both in terms of internal governance and going beyond what the law currently says they have to do. And they are looking at, some of these, I mean, they brought up all of these things. It's not something that, we brought up. The chief privacy officers, the ethical officers that we talked to, these are the folks that brought up this. So in this report, we're not taking, our perspectives on what is important. This is just a summary of what, current practice is in these international corporations.
Sure. So moving on, I just want to, there's a question from Professor Manikandan from IIT Madras. So he asks, your work on human-guided flood mapping was an interesting collaboration between the humans and machines in performing a prediction task, right? From a broader viewpoint, what do you think are some ethical considerations that are unique to human-machine collaborations compared to just machine learning alone?
Yeah, this is a terrific question. Because this is something that people are still trying to wrap their heads around. So it really depends on. So I think it also depends on whether you're thinking about this as, full on human machine teammates or human guided machine learning, in the sense that ultimately the main decisions or the major decisions are made by the human with the help of technology. So I think the ethical questions that arise are going to be slightly different in these two scenarios. So one where the machine is a full-fledged teammate, or almost a full-fledged teammate, and the other where there is, almost at, every step of the way, there is guidance from some human input. It could be an expert in what we did with the flood mapping expert, in the flood mapping exercise. It could be folks who are crisis volunteers. They're not quite the same as, full-fledged, remote sensing specialists, but they are still, offering guidance. Humans are offering guidance. So again, in that context, there is the ethical dilemma of, whatever data you're collecting, whether it's from public sources or satellites or so on and so forth, whether that data is intruding in some fashion or the other on sort of, the privacy context and things like that. So there are some questions that can be brought up in that context. Now, that said, ultimately the intent is to provide improved response in the event of crises. So just like, a lot of data sharing is going on right now with the pandemic, if the utility is for the overall social good of that particular neighborhood, there is this gray area where you think, utility may trump, the fact that maybe there is some privacy loss. Now, speaking to the specific case that we were talking about, there were no privacy risks. It went through an IRB study. There were no risks to humans because of what we were doing with the flood mapping. So that is something that any kind of project that involves, these multi-institute, multi-government agencies and so on, has to go through some kind of review board. And it ideally should go through an independent review board that has nothing to do with the particular study that is being performed. So that is one side. Now, the other side is understanding, if you have, humans and machines who are almost full-fledged teammates, one has to think about intent at that point. And that is a deep question. I don't think we have enough information on how, what is the intent of an algorithm? Do you specify it as a program? Is this something the program learns as it, in the sort of never-ending learning scheme that Tom Mitchell and others are proposing? That's a deep question. I don't think there are good answers to that question at this point.
So there are some questions that are coming up from the audience as well. So one of the questions is, the ethical concerns may be completely different across domains, right? So here is a question which asks, in domains such as manufacturing analytics, it seems AI has fewer obvious ethical challenges. And what is your take on ethics in these domains?
So, well, I mean, with any sort of process, there could be procedural I mean, like, for example, I mean, even with manufacturing, there are ethical, questions about, releasing a product that is substandard, right? I mean, so there are going to be challenges as it relates to the use of AI in certain domains. But I agree with the import of the question. The high level question is, there may be domains where these kind of things have reached a tipping point and we really need to find a solution to them. Whereas there could be other domains, I mean, like anything to do with genetics and biology. I mean, this has been going on. I mean, AI is later to the table after genetics. I mean, there's tons of, research on, genetic research in ethics and genetics, right? I mean, and so there was a scientist I guess in China, who did something that was completely unethical. I don't know all the details, but it certainly got reported in all the leading newspapers. So there's certainly some areas that are where these kind of things have to be looked at much more urgently. I would agree with that statement, because ultimately, collectively, time is zero sum. And so you might want to focus on certain things, but I haven't really given a deep thought to manufacturing per se, but I can imagine that, for example, if you have a process for generating certain types of chips, chip manufacturing and all, there are some reliability and responsibility questions. And if these chips are being installed in some of these autonomous vehicles, and these chips are being used to process, well, I think there is a risk associated with, using a substandard product, which can cause, I mean, it may not be an algorithm's, it may be an error that is propagated from the chip. And so manufacturing, certainly there are, use cases that one can sort of think about, but I have not thought about that particular domain that carefully. But certainly in areas like genetics, the use of AI in these kinds of areas, I mean, people have to scrutinize much more carefully, given some of the experiments that are already being reported as having been run.
Yeah, so I think we are running short of time. Maybe I'll want to have your final words on, let's say, what are some of the challenges that you think are ethical AI challenges that are unique to a country like India, and what do you think should be the role of the government going forward in this? And yeah, so your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, with any of these kinds of, so before we go down that route, I think there's a lot of good that can come from AI. So ultimately, it boils down to the utility versus harm, or as someone like Hume tried to articulate. I mean, there is this this tension between self-interest and and morality. There is this tension between utility and feeling. And so I think any country has to think about these things carefully. But that said, as I said at the start, I mean, right now, AI has done a lot of things. There are many successes for AI. And I don't have time to list all of them, but I mean, I think everybody here I think that is something that is important. I think when you think about talent development or education, I think one thing that every country should be doing is having these programs like what you do at IIT Madras and other parts of the country that talk about data science and AI, that have data science and AI as a part of the curriculum, but it should be supplemented with some coursework that looks at some of these ethical challenges. So from the talent development pipeline, I think a challenge, and this is not just specific to India, but also across the world, we need to have educational programs that synthesize and talk about the ethical impact and the ethical use of data for these kind of model building exercises. And that's something that is important. Now, the minute you start adding additional constraints to a model, you are going to make the model more complex in some senses. And so you need infrastructure, people infrastructure, as well as computational infrastructure. So that's another challenge that I think countries across the world are going to need to think about when they're looking at this. Again, as we've already articulated, I mean, the use of data, you had this question about data pre-processing. If you have to sanitize, and in fact, one of our survey respondents, one of our interviewees had this amazing comment. It struck all of us on the project team as incredible. One of this individual mentioned that in some companies it takes 9 months between when the data is collected and when they are finally allowed to use it. And in some cases, that's too late to have any value at that point, because there's a timeliness to use of data. And that is something that companies are wrestling with. I mean, how can you mitigate risks, but do it in a way that the data can still be useful, whether it's for social good or something else. So that's a challenge that I think organizations are definitely dealing with. Now, certainly in terms of legal and governance issues, I think the examples I gave you earlier about the US 4th and 5th Amendment, what in India has already made a start on this. I alluded to the Justice Sri Krishna report. So these are things that countries have to start thinking about. And again, it may be that these things lag the technology, but they have to start thinking about that, and they have to put resources behind these efforts, whether it be people, talent building, whether it be infrastructure building, whether it be more people who are thinking about these kinds of problems, and within the educational sort of life cycle. So those are some of the things that I think, I mean, that's not very specific to India. It's a broader set of things that I think people have to start thinking about. And certainly for example, our report that I had mentioned earlier, the executive summary is a short 9 pages or something, but the longer report is about 100 pages. And this has been picked up by policymakers, think tanks, and organizations across the country and across the world. So these kinds of things have to be, carefully rationalized and reasoned about and looked at by not just people, individuals, not just organizations, but also, nation states.
Yeah. So this has been a great chat, and I would love to go on, but in the interest of time, maybe we should probably end the session here. Again, on behalf of RBCDSAI and IITM, thank you very much, Professor Srini, for this enlightening discussion. And I'm sure going forward, even as machine learning practitioners and so on, so we should definitely take all these AI and ethics into consideration when we do our research as well, right? So thanks again for this wonderful fireside chat.
Yeah, sure. It's been a great pleasure. And Arun and Pawan, thank you very much for serving as hosts. And Ravi, thank you again for the honor and the invitation. So thank you all. And it's great to see all of you again, even though it's virtual. Yeah.
Thanks, Srini. That was great.
Thank you, Srini.